The state may close.
Thank you, Your Honor. Counsel, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. On April 11th, 2007, almost 7 years ago from today's date, Martin MacNeill murdered his wife, Michelle. Her death was not the result of an accident, and it was most certainly not the result of a heart condition. The defendant carried out a cold and calculated plan to murder his wife. He relied on his knowledge and experience as a doctor and also a lawyer to accomplish this. In the process, he obstructed justice by lying to authorities, manipulating the crime scene, and destroying important evidence. Make no mistake, the defendant's fingerprints, if you will, are all over Michelle MacNeill's death. Each witness and piece of information that you've seen or heard from in this case has brought an important element to this case. It makes up an important piece that is the puzzle that is this case against Martin MacNeill. Over the next hour or so, I'm not going to have the opportunity to speak to each piece of evidence, to each witness and what they have to say. It's your duty to rely on your memory, to help refresh your memory with your notes, to look at exhibits and so forth, to remember what's happened throughout this trial. I'm going to attempt as best I can to highlight the most significant portions that the state believes are relevant in this case. You've been instructed on the law, but I want to emphasize to you what you have not been instructed on. You have not been instructed to check your common sense at the door as you entered into this room each day over the last 3+ weeks to listen to testimony. And you will not be instructed to check your common sense and experience and collective wisdom at the door when you begin to deliberate. A trial like this is about the truth. It's not about games. It's not about gotcha moments among the attorneys or the witnesses. It's about getting to the bottom of what happened to Michelle MacNeill, and that is that she was murdered by her husband, Martin MacNeill. It's about the truth and the administration of justice. You were instructed today in instruction number 43 about motive. Motive is not an element that the state is required to prove, but it's an important piece because it explains why someone did what they did. Here, the motive of Martin MacNeill to kill his wife explains why he did it. The evidence of the defendant's motive to get rid of Michelle because she was in the way, in his own words, to an inmate is overwhelming. The case is dripping with motive, and without question it tells you why the defendant killed his wife, Michelle. November of 2005. The defendant and Gypsy Willis meet online. It's around Thanksgiving is what the testimony is from Gypsy. And the relationship turns sexual shortly afterward. Nothing of real interest is known about their relationship between early 2006 and early 2007, except that we know that sometime between then he also had an affair with Anna Walthall, and we'll talk a little bit about her importance to this case as well. However, on March 6th, 2007, the relationship turns very serious. You'll recall an email that Gypsy sent to a potential suitor online, someone that was essentially asking her out on a date. The email reads at one point, she's declining his offer to meet and to go out. And in her response email, she says, "I've looked forward to meeting you in person for a long time, but I'm afraid that won't happen now. A very good and best friend of mine has recently become much more than that." March 6, 2007, just over a month before Michelle's death. The language is very important. A best friend of mine has recently become much more than that. And Gypsy testified that that good friend, that best friend, was Martin MacNeill, the defendant. Approximately a week later, there's another exchange between this individual online and Gypsy. She responds again to another email and talks a little bit more about her relationship with the defendant in describing, I met him online a year and a half ago. We've always been great together. I guess he felt the way you do, like the friendship was too good to tempt fate and go anywhere else with it. After we had a conversation to that effect about a year ago, I went back to dating and being available. But just recently, March 13th, just recently his reasoning and views changed, and we are together now. What changed, ladies and gentlemen? What changed? Now, less than a month before Michelle's death, his reasoning, the defendant's reasoning and views changed, and we are together now. The defendant was a married man, had a beautiful wife, a wonderful family, but things had changed because he and Gypsy were now together. At trial, Gypsy Willis testified that her relationship was casual. She took the stand and talked about the death or the circumstances of the death of Michelle MacNeill on April 11th, 2007, like it was just any other day. It was offensive. It was transparent. Her desire to protect the defendant and her minimizing of the relationship. Don't be fooled by her act. Let's call a spade a spade. Her interests are very clear here. She minimized just about every opportunity she could get when talking about the relationship and her knowledge. Actions, ladies and gentlemen, speak louder than words. And Gypsy's and Martin's actions with respect to their relationship is what really tells the story here. February and March of 2007, we learned from testimony from Gypsy. And again, Gypsy would just simply give us what we could prove through other means. We got the tip of the iceberg when she would testify. She talked about the defendant moving her into a duplex in Lehigh a month before Michelle's death, paying her rent, giving her a debit card for her personal expenses, and helping her out with nursing school. A casual relationship, I ask? The defendant was also asking neighbors. You heard testimony from Angie Aguilar that the defendant was asking her about moving a nurse into a nearby home to house sit. This was approximately a month before Michelle's death. She testified that 2 or 3 weeks or so after Michelle's death, when Gypsy came into the neighborhood and came into the MacNeill home to be the nanny, that it was her clear understanding that Gypsy Willis, known to her as Jillian, was in fact that nurse that he was looking for a place for to house sit. Fast forward to March 20th. At the request of Michelle, Alexis calls Gypsy's number. They find Gypsy's number on the defendant's cell phone. Cell phone records confirm that she called 3 times on March 20th, 8:46 a.m. Now this is, of course, Las Vegas time, so Pacific time, 8:46, 8:47, and then later that evening at 5:41. Easel's about to fall, Your Honor. I can use another one. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. So we have proof that Alexis actually followed up at the request of Michelle and called that number, and a woman answered. Later, she testified that she investigated the number and found out that it belonged to a Gypsy Willis. She told Michelle about what she had found, and her mother confided in her that she believed the defendant was having an affair and that she had confronted him. Martin's secret life with Gypsy Willis was beginning to intersect with his life with Michelle. He was going to have to make a choice between Michelle or Gypsy. Only 2 days later, after March 20th, is the first consultation with Dr. Thompson for plastic surgery. We're going to fast forward now to the day of April 11th, 2007, the day Michelle died. The defendant tells his daughter Rachel that afternoon, after returning from the hospital, after Rachel has found out about her mother's death. He returns home and tells her that they need a nanny. And this is despite Rachel having quit her job and making herself available to help care for the children. The day of Michelle's death, he's talking about bringing a nanny into the home. Fast forward 3 days to Michelle's funeral on April 14th, 2007. You heard testimony from Lanny Swallow, a family friend of the MacNeills from a prior neighborhood in Orem, who attended the funeral and approached the defendant after the services and offered herself to help care for the children, to nanny for the children. What was the response from the defendant on Michelle's funeral date? The defendant told her he had already had a nurse that he was going to hire as the children's nanny. Fast forward to the next week. You heard from Rachel talking about the Temple incident in American Fork. The defendant had talked to Rachel about the need for a nanny. There was some debate, some disagreement as to whether or not a nanny would be needed because older sisters had made themselves available to help care for the children. He indicated, let's go to the temple and let's pray about it. Let's seek some inspiration from on high about whether or not a nanny is needed. Rachel met the defendant at the temple that day. They went inside and separated. Rachel completed her worship service, went outside, or tried to find the defendant and couldn't find the defendant. So she got in her car and left, drove by his place of employment, the State Developmental Center, which was nearby, was still in her car when she received a phone call. It was from the defendant. He was very upset. "Where are you, Rachel? Where are you?" She went on to explain that, "I couldn't find you, Dad." He ordered her to come back to the temple because they needed to have this moment together to think and contemplate about a nanny. She returns to the temple. They sit on a bench outside. They're discussing things, and up walks this woman out of nowhere, as if it was a miracle. This woman introduces herself as Jillian. The defendant plays dumb, pretending to have only met her in passing. Even takes out his cell phone and pretends to put her number inside of his cell phone, despite the fact that records show that they've contacted each other dozens of times in the weeks preceding this. Takes her name down as Jillian. Gypsy testified in trial that the incident in American Fork was staged by the defendant to ease her into the family under the most positive light, to bring her into the family. This was a week, approximately 1 week after Michelle's death. Only days later, Martin sets up a hiring board for a nanny. Vanessa, Damien, and Damien's girlfriend Eileen Hang make up the board. The defendant tells everyone that he's advertised for the position, he's put flyers up. He talks about how there's a number of applicants, but the only person to show up to be interviewed is Gypsy Willis, or Jillian, as she introduced herself. It was all a farce. As soon as she was interviewed, the defendant decides to hire her. From the testimony, she comes into the home approximately 2 to 3 weeks after Michelle's death. 2 weeks after his wife's death, and the defendant's paramour, his mistress, is in the home. And the testimony is shortly thereafter, the sexual relations begin again. The defendant called Alexis after he hired Gypsy and said, "Hey, I found the perfect nanny." Proceeds to tell her her name is Jillian. And Alexis interrupts, "Dad, you mean Gypsy Jillian Willis? Mom thought you were having an affair with a woman named Gypsy." The defendant gets upset, tells her she's no longer welcome in the home. Gypsy was introduced to neighbors, to include Angie Aguilar, 2 or 3 weeks or so after Michelle's death. And again, Angie indicates that was the nurse that the defendant was shopping around to find a place to house sit in the neighborhood. You heard testimony from a number of the daughters that Gypsy didn't function as a nanny. She rarely took the kids around. She didn't clean. She cooked one time, I believe is what Sabrina said. But she would sit around and stare at the defendant, all goo-eyed. You also heard from Eileen Hang, Damien's girlfriend, that they went out to eat with Gypsy and Martin was Gypsy was eating off Martin's plate. A very odd conduct for just a nanny. Early May of 2007, less than a month after Michelle's death, and Gypsy and Martin begin to visit her parents up in Wyoming. This is before Mother's Day, because we know that following their visit, Martin writes a letter to Gypsy's mom, Vicki. The letter's been introduced as a piece of evidence in this case. The language he uses is very important. Dated May 7th, 2007, the original letter is marked as an exhibit for your review when you deliberate. In the third paragraph, it reads, "I'm not privy to all of the issues in your relationship with Gypsy, but I see her as loving, caring, kind, compassionate woman, and I will be eternally grateful that she has become such an important part of my life." Eternally grateful that she's a part of his life, less than 1 month after Michelle's death. Vicki Willis also testified that in a trip into town, into Cheyenne, because they lived on the outskirts in the country of the city, that the defendant told her that he never really loved Michelle. And then he conceded he loved her more like a sister, but not like he loves Gypsy. She also testified that they told her that Michelle had died in January of 2007. To justify the relationship. Had they indicated it was April 11th, 2007, less than a month, it would have raised serious concerns. We now have Martin, the defendant, and his motive, Gypsy Willis, talking about Michelle's death date, taking control of her death date. You also heard testimony that around July 4th, Martin paid for a room in the nicest restaurant in town, and in front of the whole family, on bended knee, he proposed to Gypsy. By the late summer, the defendant and Gypsy are holding themselves out to be married. And perhaps the most significant piece of evidence that goes to motive and really tells the story about what happened on April 11th, 2007, and what was happening in the weeks leading up to that, is the application that the defendant filled out, that he signed, that Gypsy also signed. It was an application where they presented themselves as married. Gypsy called herself Jillian G. MacNeill, and they were required to put a marital status date. And the marital status date that they chose to put down on the application was April 14th, 2007. That is the date Michelle was buried, 3 days after her death. Ladies and gentlemen, that is nothing short of an admission of guilt. That screams to you about what happened on April 11th, 2007. The defendant may as well have said in his application, "I murdered Michelle." The document speaks for itself, ladies and gentlemen. It's not affected by bias. It's not affected by motive. It is what it is, and it's the defendant's doing. Yesterday, in testimony from Gypsy when she was recalled, we went over several prison letters that were exchanged between the two years after. Again, Gypsy minimizing the relationship when she testified here in court, but documents that she referred to and read into court illustrate the true nature of their relationship. Some of the statements the defendant said to her in those letters: I love you with all my heart. I dream of you. Can't handle being separated. I have loved you from the day we met. They met in 2005. I can think of nothing but how wonderful you are. You are worth everything I go through to get you back in my life. He even wrote, let's get married and shut these people up once and for all. These letters also serve to corroborate inmates 1 and 2 when they talked about Martin MacNeill having a girlfriend on the outside that would be released before him. Gypsy talked about the release date and that he was writing his girl all the time. Gypsy Willis and the defendant's desire to be with her is his primary motive for killing Michelle. She's the reason he did it. He was at a crossroads. Michelle was onto him, and his secret life was coming to light. That, coupled with the testimony you heard from inmate number 1 yesterday that she was in the way, the testimony you heard from Jason Poirier that his marriage was going downhill, she was going to take the money and the kids, wasn't going to let him keep cheating on her, drove him to murder. And this application, ladies and gentlemen, has the same significance as I'm glad the bitch is dead. That is what this application screams. I am glad the bitch is dead. The defendant was at a crossroads. And on April 11th, well, it was before then. It started in March when he started to make his plans through the plastic surgery and the drugs he would get Dr. Thompson to administer to her, to prescribe to her, was when he started his plan. That's when he made his decision. He was at a crossroads. He had to choose between Michelle and Gypsy. He chose Gypsy. He chose Gypsy over Michelle. We've talked about motive. Let's talk about means, his planning and know-how. Evidence of the defendant's planning and know-how, his knowledge to carry out this crime of murder of his wife is overwhelming. Back up to March 22nd, 2007. This is the date that Michelle and the defendant attended the first plastic surgery consultation with Dr. Thompson. The doctor testified that it was the defendant that called and scheduled the appointment. He said the defendant spoke a lot during the consultation and that he was the dominant personality. They quickly decided on what procedures Michelle would have done, and surgery was scheduled for April 3rd, 2007. Fast forward 1 week to March 29th, 2007. Michelle and the defendant attend her preoperative physical with Dr. Von Welch. He was the second doctor to testify in this trial. The defendant was observed by this doctor to be the one pushing for the surgery, and that he didn't want to delay it. Michelle, on the other hand, was expressing hesitation and wanted to postpone it. Dr. Welch described Michelle as quiet and that the defendant was answering the questions. He testified the defendant seemed urgent and anxious about getting the surgery done. It caused the doctor to ultimately ask or to excuse the defendant so that he could consult personally with Michelle because she was the patient. As part of this physical, Dr. Welch had an EKG and blood test done. Michelle was found to have slightly elevated blood pressure and depression, but otherwise she was found to be in excellent health. Her heart was within normal rhythm and there was no evidence of heart disease. However, Dr. Welch and Michelle discussed putting off the surgery. Dr. Welch testified that he was shocked to hear only 2 weeks later that Michelle had died because she was in excellent health, first off, and number 2, he fully expected that she would postpone the surgery. She was hesitant and didn't want to go forward. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the first circumstance in a pattern here where we see that Martin MacNeill is the dominant personality. He controls Michelle at the end of the day. Despite her objections despite her confronting him with the affair, at the end of the day, when push came to shove, Martin, his personality, his desires, and his wishes carried the day. In addition to this well-established fact that Michelle didn't want to go forward, but did anyway, there was the argument that was overheard by Alexis between her parents on the way up to this final preoperative consultation with Dr. Thompson, the plastic surgeon, where she's expressing hesitation. She wants to lose a little bit of weight. She wants to get better control over her blood pressure before she moves forward. The defendant is not going to have anything of that. He's already paid for the surgery. It's already on the surgeon's schedule. It would inconvenience him to have to change that. She nonetheless goes forward. We'll talk a little bit more about April 4th, the first night she was home after surgery. This was when he pumped her full of drugs, all those narcotics that he got her prescribed. When she comes to and she's lucid enough to talk with Alexis the next day, that afternoon or early that evening, she begins to express what the defendant had done. Alexis talked about the fear in her voice. It clearly alarmed her. Nonetheless, she took the drugs. At the end of the day, Martin controls Michelle. On the date of March 29th, 2007, the date of the physical for Michelle in anticipation of surgery, Martin calls Gypsy one time from work and texts her 38 times. April 1st, 2007, Michelle and the defendant attend the final preoperative appointment. I believe I misspoke when I said this is the final preoperative appointment with Dr. Thompson. This is one where Alexis was present. This was the day when Michelle and the defendant argued in the car before the appointment. The defendant's wishes carried the day. And once they get to the appointment and start talking to Dr. Thompson, again, it illustrates the defendant's intent, what he's about. What the defendant is about to get prescribed to Michelle and pushing the surgery. The surgery and the narcotics that he gets her prescribed are the vehicles he uses to kill Michelle MacNeill. They were also his cover in working through Dr. Thompson and setting up this plastic surgery and getting the drugs through Dr. Thompson. They were also his cover to hide from the almost perfect murder. And I say almost perfect murder because along the way he left a number of clues. A number of clues that all point to him as a murderer. During this final meeting with Dr. Thompson, the defendant asked for a specific set of prescription drugs for his wife. Dr. Thompson testified that he prescribed more than he normally would have, and the only reason he did it was because Martin MacNeill was a physician and he would be caring for her. Dr. Thompson also testified that he explained in very clear terms that the drugs were only to be used as needed and not all at once. And he described in testimony that these drugs had an overlapping effect. She wouldn't need all of them. If she had some anxiety, which we have no evidence of, she didn't have to have the Valium. If she was taking the Percocet, it would have some overlapping effect. The Percocet would also reduce her central nervous system. She wouldn't really need an Ambien to sleep because that would assist her with it. And these are facts that the defendant already knows about because he's a doctor. I'd like to remind you of some of the testimony from Dr. Von Welch. Again, he's the one that did the preoperative physical. He testified about the defendant's experience and his knowledge. He testified that he had been impressed with the defendant's ability to reduce the medications on the residents or the patients at the Utah State Developmental Center to the point they weren't overly sedated, but yet they weren't suffering seizures. Dr. Martin MacNeill was able to find that happy medium, that special place where the drugs he administered to his patients only met the therapeutic needs of the patient didn't go beyond that. He has a special and unique knowledge. You heard testimony from Anna Walthall. Anna Walthall was another mistress that the defendant had. She testified that the defendant told her he could administer a certain substance that could induce a heart attack and that it wouldn't be detected. The defendant had the unique ability, in other words, to cause someone to suffer from an ailment, an injury like a heart attack that could cause that person's death, and it could not be detected. It could be done in plain sight. No one would even know. You heard from inmate number 2 a couple of days ago. He testified, quote, they can't prove it because all the drugs were prescribed. Shows evidence of his plan, his knowledge and know-how about what he was doing. You've heard testimony that the defendant was the family's primary caregiver. There's an exhibit received into the court. It's called a Doppel report from Michelle MacNeill, and it shows the medications that she's been prescribed over the years. And on that you'll see that the defendant has prescribed her medications in the past. On that you'll see also that Steve Mickelson, a colleague, a nurse practitioner that worked with the defendant, had also prescribed, at this time, narcotics to Michelle. He testified in trial that that was done as a professional courtesy on the part of the defendant. But when it comes to this circumstance here, he works through Dr. Thompson as a way to cover himself. A day or so before this final preoperative meeting with Dr. Thompson, Alexis testified that she saw the defendant looking through a PDR, or the physician's desk reference that was at the house. It was all dusty. She'd never seen him looking through it before. She asked him about it, and he said that he was researching the interactions of drugs that he wanted prescribed to Michelle. Number one, he has a special and unique knowledge. He's doing more research on the subject. Fast forward to April 4th, the first night she's home, the first moment he has alone with Michelle, and he drugs her up, leaving her heavily sedated and unresponsive that morning. On the date of this final appointment with Dr. Thompson, records show that he and Gypsy texted each other 6 times. On April 3rd, 2007, Michelle has her surgery. She has a lower and mid facelift, a forehead lift, and eyelid surgery. Pretty significant plastic surgery. Dr. Thompson indicated that the surgery was a success. Michelle stayed the night in the hospital and was discharged the next morning. You'll recall that the defendant wasn't happy about her staying overnight. He wanted her to come home that night. Ultimately, he relented after speaking with Dr. Thompson. Alexis had to drive the defendant home because he had to work the next day, go back up to the hospital to be with her mother, and they came home the next day. The phone calls and the text between Gypsy and Martin on that day of April 3rd, 2007, the date of Michelle's surgery, 24 texts that they exchanged. April 4th, 2007, the first night that Michelle is home. The defendant insists that Alexis go to bed. Go to bed, I'll take care of Mom tonight, don't worry. Alexis goes to bed in a nearby room. If you recall, Michelle's eyes are completely bandaged. She's blind. She's completely reliant upon those around her to help care for her. The defendant that night between 12 a.m. and 1:30 a.m. gives her Valium, liquid Lortab, Phenergan, 2 Percocet tablets, and an Ambien. And the defendant and Gypsy exchanged 19 text messages between 10:47 p.m. on April 4th and 10:16 a.m. April 5th. The defendant even called Gypsy from his work phone at 9:42. You don't have to take my word for it. There's the evidence of the text messages and the number of text messages exchanged. Here's the evidence of the phone call from his office. We don't know exactly what time he told Alexis to go to bed, but at 9:42 that evening, he's calling Gypsy from work. And if you recall, The first time that Martin actually calls her from his cell phone, because if you recall, the defendant, or excuse me, Michelle is on to him. She's on to Gypsy's number. She wants to see phone records. The first time he calls her for some time around the death of Michelle from his cell phone is on the date of the funeral. Alexis wakes up April 5th in the morning, runs to her, or goes to her mother's side. It's about 6 a.m. in the morning, and finds her heavily sedated, unresponsive. She shakes her, tries to get her to wake up, and she won't wake up. She's breathing. Her pulse is okay. She goes to the defendant and asks him, what in the world happened? What did you do? And he admits to having given her all of these drugs. Admits he may have over-medicated her. Alexis was keeping a tally of what she was giving to Michelle. And this is what she writes. The arnica, Dr. Thompson, I believe, testified that that's for swelling, or bruising, excuse me, from surgery. Valium, Lortab, that's the liquid Lortab, Phenergan, 2 Percocets, and Ambien, all between 12 a.m. and 1:30 a.m. Alexis stays by her side that day for the most part, continuing to check on her vitals, making sure she's okay, dressing her wounds. She begins to give her some medications, and about 7 hours after finding her, she gives Michelle her first medications in pill form. Another couple hours later, she gives her a Percocet because she's having some pain. There's some moaning. She can clearly see that she's in pain. But later that night, or early evening, Michelle wakes up and she's lucid enough to talk to Alexis, and she says, your dad just kept giving me medications, telling me to swallow until I threw up. From that point on, at least until she has her bandages removed from her eyes, Michelle wants to feel each pill before she takes it because she's concerned. The timing of this overdose is significant, ladies and gentlemen, because it was the first opportunity the defendant had to be alone with his wife following the surgery, where he was in control of the drugs. Alexis stayed by her mother's side, essentially, for the several days afterward, until she left April 10th to go home to resume her studies in Nevada, in the Vegas area. She was in medical school. The very next morning, when the defendant has access to her, Michelle's dead by 11:30 or so, dead in the bathtub. And she has almost the same cocktail of drugs that he administered to her on April 4th. Alexis testified that Michelle was sensitive to medication. She had a history of being sensitive to medications, and even the Doppel report would show that she was rarely prescribed medications, especially in narcotic form. She didn't like to take them. Alexis is caring for her April 6th through April 10th. They attend some post-operative visits with Dr. Thompson. Additional information that's been admitted are other days on the Zyrtec pad where Alexis is noting what she's giving to her mom in the form of medications. You'll note that she never gave her any Valium, she never gave her Phenergan, and she never gave her Ambien during this period because she didn't need it. All drugs that were found in Michelle's system in autopsy, in toxicology results on April 11th, 2007. When Michelle was attending her post-operative appointments with Dr. Thompson, she was walking. He described her recovery as typical, nothing abnormal according to the doctor. She was tapering down to 1 to 2 Percocets a day, and it's even noted in the doctor's notes that she was down to 1 to 2 Percocets a day. April 8th, Alexis overhears an argument between Michelle and the defendant, arguing over phone records. And Michelle challenges the defendant about having an affair with Gypsy. He calls her claims ridiculous, denies the affair. April 10th, 2007, the last post-operative visit with Dr. Thompson. She's continuing to improve. She's tapered down significantly. He testified that she could have driven at that point, She was walking around. She was in good spirits. She was recovering just fine. Michelle, Alexis, and the defendant ate at Sizzler that evening before they dropped Alexis off at the airport to go home to Nevada. That night, Alexis talked with Michelle on the phone after returning to Vegas. She testified that Michelle told her that she was feeling just fine. Phone records show that Alexis talked to her mom at 8 and 8:45 Nevada time, so 9 o'clock and 9:45 Utah time. 2 minutes and 2 minutes. Michelle was doing perfectly fine the night before her death. Phone calls and texts between Gypsy and Martin on April 10th. There was 1 phone call, 36 regular texts, and 8 additional texts with pictures. Let's talk a little bit about opportunity, the defendant's commission and actual commission of this crime. April 11th, 2007, the day Michelle MacNeill died. The defendant goes to work early that morning, returns to Pleasant Grove to take his younger children to school, and then goes back to work. Sabrina testified that she saw her mom that morning and that she was feeling well. She was a little tired. She was outside of the hospital bed that had been brought into the home, and she was sitting on the couch. Alexis testified that she spoke with her mother that morning, and Michelle was in good spirits. She said she was feeling well. She said she was getting ready for the day. She talked about her plans to pick up Ada from school. We know Ada was picked up about 11:30, 11:35 that morning. And she had plans to take the girls to ballet. Phone records confirm that at 8:44 in the morning, there was a conversation between Alexis and her mother. It lasted approximately 2 minutes. Michelle was doing fine, had plans for the day. At about 9:10 that morning, Alexis receives a phone call. Well, she receives a call from her father. These are Alexis's records, so the 8:10 is actually 9:10 Utah time. It's a voicemail left by her father. And it's a bizarre voicemail because only 25 minutes or so before, she has spoken with her mom, and her mom is feeling completely fine. But in the voicemail that she receives from her father, that she listens to during a break between lectures, her father tells her she needs to call Michelle because her mother's out of bed and she needed to rest. It comes from her father's work line. Alexis called home at about 10:50 a.m. to speak with her mother. No one answers. So at 10:50, no one answers. She goes to another lecture, calls again at about 11:59 a.m. This time her father answers. He's stressed. He indicates Michelle isn't breathing, that he's called an ambulance. Alexis drops everything and rushes to the airport. 2 other very important and interesting calls that the defendant makes that day. He calls Michelle's cell phone at 9:17. There was a phone call at 9:11 as well from his work, and he leaves a message on Michelle's cell phone. He calls again at 11:32 a.m., calls Michelle's cell phone, and leaves another message. She didn't answer the phones. She didn't answer the phone. We know about these messages because Vanessa testified about them. Vanessa testified that upon hearing her mother had died, she broke her phone. She was given her mother's phone after her death, and there are these 2 bizarre voicemails. In them, the defendant is telling Michelle not to go anywhere, not to call anyone. He says he's going to be home and fix a lovely lunch, and she testified that the messages were essentially the same, both of them. At about 11:45, or shortly before, Ada MacNeill, 6 years old at the time, comes into the home and finds her mother dead in the bathtub. In her interview with at the Children's Justice Center that you heard, she says, "Mom, we're home." She said she found her mom lying down all the way inside the tub, all the way inside the tub, a very small tub, but she's all the way inside the tub. She describes the water like a lake that was all brown. She said her mother was wetting her hair and that she was fully dressed. The defendant then gets Ada to go next door to get help. During this time that Ada is gone to get help, the defendant drains the tub. You heard from a defense expert yesterday that it made it that much more difficult to extract her, to pull her from the tub because it was drained. He calls 911, tells them that, hangs up twice. Dispatch has to call back. He's screaming on the phone. You've listened to the recording twice. He twice says he's in the process of administering CPR. The defendant was in fact not doing CPR. He couldn't do CPR because she was sitting up in the tub. He couldn't do the chest compressions. He couldn't give her effective breaths, clear the airway to make it effective, but he tells dispatch he's performing CPR. He couldn't lift her out of the tub, ladies and gentlemen. Martin MacNeill, who was about 206 pounds, 6'2", could not get his wife out of the tub. You heard from an expert yesterday, an expert that talks about occupational safety hazards, that standing about right here, it wouldn't be reasonable for him to have taken her out of the tub. Ladies and gentlemen, what about getting inside the tub and maybe straddling her, grabbing her from her shoulders, pulling her, maybe rolling her over, getting her onto the ground to where he can actually provide life-saving measures? What about grabbing her feet and maybe pulling her, doing something, doing everything you could to try and save your wife's life? But he couldn't do anything because he had a hurt toe, or maybe he had cancer. He'd been using that cane off and on. Neighbors start arriving. Christy Daniels, Angie Aguilar, they offer their help. He says, "I need a man's help." Doug Daniels arrives shortly thereafter and is able to take her out. Interestingly enough, Martin's the one that carries most of the load because he picks her up under the shoulders to take her out and put her on the floor. Doug has the feet. You heard this expert testify yesterday. In his report, 2 people can't reasonably be expected to have taken her out of the tub because they'd be fighting against each other. It's ridiculous. This isn't occupational hazard safety. This is about trying to save someone's life, trying to save your wife's life. Instead, life-saving efforts are prolonged, and they don't happen. When Doug Daniels arrive, they get her out of the tub, they begin to perform CPR. She has mucus all over her face. Martin MacNeill's giving her breath, supposedly. There's no mucus transfer. Her chest isn't rising. Doug Daniels was very clear her chest was not rising. As soon as the professionals show up, paramedic, law enforcement, and then paramedics, they start working on her. After a short time, they take her outside into the master bedroom where there's a little more room, start working on her. She begins to throw up. She throws up 3 to 4 cups of water the first time, filling one of the officer's boots and a glove that he had on. They turn her head, and she throws up an additional approximately 3 cups of water, or under 3 cups of water was the testimony, I believe, from Officer Ormond. This time it was frothy and pink, which is a significant indication of drowning because the water is coming from the lungs and there's a mixture of blood in it. So when the professionals, although with all due respect, paramedics and law enforcement are not a professional in the medical field compared to a doctor, but when they show up, they're able to effectively do something. What happened to Michelle's pants? Ada described Michelle as fully clothed. There's no reason to disbelieve Ada MacNeill. She testified when she was 7 years old. You saw the interview. Where did her pants go? And no one found her pants. No one observed her pants. There was some dispute as to what Michelle was wearing, but we all know what she was wearing. It's into evidence. There was a black top. There's a white LDS garment top and a bra that had been cut off of her in the life-saving efforts. Doug Daniels testified that when he was at the scene with the defendant is screaming or loudly exclaiming, "Why? Why would you do this? All for a stupid surgery. Let's blame it on Michelle. Michelle's not the one that was pushing for the surgery. It was the defendant. The defendant's caught in another lie. He's putting on an act in the presence of other people to deflect suspicion away from him." This bathtub, ladies and gentlemen, has an important story to tell, okay? When you look at this bathtub, it's a very small bathtub. You consider her body position with the faucet over here. It's in the reverse position of where someone would get into a bath and nod off. It'd be almost impossible in this bath to slip under the water. The drain here, the overflow drain, is all the way down here. It's a pretty difficult task to get down into the tub that far to accidentally nod off. You heard testimony from Dr. Van Wagener, the ER doctor, that there was no injuries to her shoulders, the back of her shoulders, or to the back of her head that would suggest that she somehow fell back into the tub this way. That's the position she was found in. That's what the neighbors all testified to. Where's the injury from that, ladies and gentlemen? There was a cut up here on the scalp, but it's clear from Dr. Thompson's testimony that was part of the forehead lift. That was an incision that he made. Had nothing to do with trauma from falling. She didn't fall into the tub. Angie Aguilar remembers the defendant saying on the scene, "I told her not to do this," speaking of the plastic surgery. She also talked about the defendant using a cane leading up to the surgery, or leading up to this time frame and shortly thereafter, but then it disappeared. When EMTs arrived, they talked about Michelle being pale and bluish in color. Of course, they start working on her and she throws up. Paramedics and law enforcement talk about him screaming at the scene, blaming the surgery and medications on Michelle's death. Why medications? Why is he blaming it on medications, ladies and gentlemen? As far as anyone knows, she's down to 1 to 2 Percocets a day. But he's blaming it on the medications. Why? Because he administered the medications to her. He described to authorities that he found Michelle slumped over in the tub, said he believed that she'd passed out and fallen into the tub. Officer Motzinger testified the defendant said that Michelle was taking a lot of medications. She wasn't taking a lot of medications. Chief Sanderson described the defendant giving orders when they all arrived on how to save Michelle. But keep in mind, when he was in charge of the scene, he wasn't doing anything. There was no CPR being performed. Chief Sanderson also testified that that the defendant said she must have overdosed on pain medications, slipped and fallen, and hit her head. Defendant was also loudly questioning why Michelle had to get this stupid surgery and cursing God for repaying him this way. Again, the defendant is making a scene in front of police and paramedics this time. He's going to make sure that others see him making this scene to deflect suspicion away from him. Despite the well-established fact that it was Martin MacNeill, Dr. MacNeill, that was pushing for the surgery that had requested the specific medications. What was the defendant doing on the morning of Michelle's death? Between 9:30 a.m. and about 11 a.m., no one really knows about Martin MacNeill's whereabouts. And he had been at work that morning, certainly. And we know he was back at work by 11 o'clock because he places a phone call at 11 o'clock from his office and had placed a phone call about 9:30, about 9:26 or so, I believe, from his office. But there's about an hour and a half period of time where no one really knows where Martin is. And no one who took the stand and testified could talk about where Martin was. You heard testimony from Detective Jeff Robinson that traveling at a speed of 50 miles per hour, this would not count walk time, so you can add approximately a minute and a half, 2 minutes. But he was 3 minutes and 7 seconds from his home, If he was traveling 25 miles per hour, he would be 5 minutes and 39 seconds from his home. Plenty of time. Rush home, take care of your business, give Michelle the drugs, fix her up a bath, get her in the tub, hold her head down for a little while, and help her out. We know the defendant that day was scheduled to receive an award on behalf of his department at the Safety Fair at the Utah State Developmental Center. It was to be received at 11:45 p.m. when most people would be there. That's the testimony from Melissa Frost, who was running the fair. But due to the defendant's request, there were some phone calls made. It was moved up a few hours. Melissa Frost wasn't happy about that, but it's moved up a few hours when he's supposed to receive it. And then it's changed again through phone calls at the request of the defendant that it needed to be given to him at a moment's notice. Melissa Frost gets a phone call about 10:40 or 10:50 saying, you need to have it ready as soon as possible. As soon as Dr. MacNeill is ready, he needs to get his award. And then we hear all the testimony about the defendant wanting his picture taken, even telling Roma Henry, did you get me in the picture? Do you need to take another picture? He needs his picture taken. This was at the Safety Fair, we believe, between about 11 and 11:15 or so. I believe he makes about a 6-minute call from his office at 11 o'clock. So probably closer to 11:10, 11:15, maybe 11:20. He sticks around for a few minutes before he has to go pick up his daughter Ada from school and then return home. At the ER, he continues to make a scene, continues to deflect suspicion from himself. Dr. Van Wagener talks about the oddest request he'd ever received. I'll give you $10,000, the defendant says to Dr. Van Wagener. I'll give you $10,000 if you'll continue your resuscitation efforts. Michelle is long gone by then. No signs of life upon arrival to the ER. Nothing. $10,000 to continue. Martin also expressed to the doctor that he was very against Michelle having the surgery. Why did you have this done? He questions. He also expressed concern about too many medications. She must have passed out in the bathtub. What medications, ladies and gentlemen? She was down to 1 to 2 Percocets a day. Confirmed by Alexis in her testimony and Dr. Thompson in his notes. Martin returns from the hospital and goes home that afternoon. Eileen Hang, Damien's girlfriend, is at the house. She hears about it and comes to the house. Very close to the family. She interacted with the defendant all the time, she testified. And the defendant asks her to flush the drugs down the toilet. They count them, and then he flushes them. Has her flush them. And she dumps the prescription bottles in the trash. He says he wanted to get rid of the pills as he couldn't bear to look at them because they may have contributed in some fashion to Michelle's death. She wasn't taking medications. She also talked about and confirmed the bloody wet spot on the carpet outside the bathroom where she had thrown up the water when paramedics and law enforcement were working on her. Alexis returns home. As soon as she finds out about her mother in significant distress, she drops everything, gets to the airport, flies home. She gets home sometime that afternoon. As soon as she gets home, she goes looking for her mother's prescriptions. They're gone. She also can't find the black book that she's been using in replacing the Zyrtec pad, talking about what she was giving to Michelle. The black book is also gone. She approaches the defendant and asks him, where are the drugs? What's going on with the drugs? And he says, oh, the police might have taken them. He's just had them flushed by Eileen Hang not too long before. The defendant then goes on to demonstrate the body position of Michelle, how he found Michelle. And Alexis testified that it was something to the effect of her arms and head were down, submerged in the water, with her feet sticking out. She's not all the way inside the tub like Ada testified to. She's certainly not in the position where the neighbors found her, his explanation is consistent with, she must have been on too many medications and she accidentally fell into the tub. The next day, Alexis is party to a conversation that the defendant has, and she has, with the medical examiner, Dr. Maureen Fricke, where the defendant again lies about Michelle's body position. Contrary to every other witness, he explains what appears to be an accident, a fall. Rachel MacNeill returns to the Pleasant Grove home that afternoon or that maybe even early evening upon hearing about her mother's passing. She finds Michelle's wet clothing in a pile in the garage. She doesn't find any pants. We don't know where the pants are. The defendant tells her that he needed an autopsy performed. We need an autopsy performed. He's worried about a police investigation. Why? Why is he worried about a police investigation? It's consciousness of guilt. The clues he left behind. The almost perfect murder. He describes and demonstrates the body position that Michelle was found in, just like Alexis. Rachel was also party to the conversation that the defendant had with the medical examiner. She was there where he describes the body position to the medical examiner consistent with how he demonstrated. Again, making it look like a fall. Sabrina testified that afternoon or that evening when she gets home, because a friend of the family picked them up from school, that the defendant walks in and has a towel over his face. He's upset. And the way he tells her that her mother's died is, I'm just glad families are forever. At the funeral, you heard from Michelle's Michelle's sister Linda Clough. She talked about driving up with her husband to the funeral. The defendant's unloading boxes. He's not using a cane. He's not walking with a limp or anything. But at the funeral, he's got his cane and he's walking with a limp. And then she sees him later at the graveside services. He puts his cane down or gives it to the funeral director, I believe the testimony was. Picks up Ada. He's walking with her fine. Looks around, people seeing he's not using the cane. He's walking fine. He puts her down, grabs the cane, and begins to limp again. Steve Mickelson, the colleague of Martin MacNeill, who responded to the home that afternoon, talks about a conversation or seeing the defendant the next week at work, and he testifies he's got a different wedding band on with a distinctive black stripe, different than what he'd had on before. He describes to him that he found Michelle face down the wrong way in the tub, again suggesting an accident. You've heard a number of pieces of evidence, medical evidence. You heard from Dr. Gary Dawson, a toxicologist. He talked about the Percocet, Valium, Ambien, and Phenergan that were found in Michelle's system. He testified that it would be likely that a person wouldn't have been able to respond to their environment with these drugs. Cognitive impairment would be profound. They would be difficult to arouse, and they would not be alert. No scene disarray, no evidence of a struggle with respect to the drowning because she was out of it, unable to respond to her environment. You heard from Dr. Gray, the medical examiner, the chief medical examiner for the state of Utah. He talked about the limitations on medical examiners in getting to the bottom of someone's cause and certainly their manner of death at times. He indicated that while he did not find drowning as the cause of death, there was room for a difference of opinion, and she may have drowned. He also admitted, he responded yes to a question of if the defendant had told someone that he had drugged up his wife, that he'd gotten her into the tub, pushed her head under the water, and drowned her, would that be consistent with the autopsy findings? And he said yes. He talked about how medicine's not a science. As medical examiners, we don't assign culpability and responsibility for someone's death because that's the role of a jury, of a fact finder. A medical examiner's role is to examine evidence from the body. They're limited in considering other factors like motive and admissions on the part of a suspect. He's tied to the body. He found that Michelle had died of myocarditis and drug toxicity. Drug toxicity being very important in this case because of the number of drugs found in her position, in her body. And talked about how Dr. Fricke had found that she had appeared to die of myocarditis. She was hedging in her finding there. He talked about arrhythmia, something that you heard from the defense would be the cause of Michelle's death. That arrhythmia is not something that can be diagnosed. It would be pure speculation. An arrhythmia doesn't leave a footprint behind. She wasn't diagnosed with an arrhythmia. She'd have to be hooked up to an EKG at the time of her death to know if she died of an arrhythmia. Dr. Cragen, a local cardiologist, testified that he reviewed Michelle's records and materials. Myocarditis didn't kill Michelle MacNeill. She wasn't manifesting symptoms like he would have expected. Her heart rhythm was within the normal range on the EKG. Her chance of a sudden cardiac event would be very rare because of the lack of symptoms, the benign blood work, no changes of significance in the EKG records. Her heart rhythm was within the normal range. You then heard from Dr. Perper, the state's expert from Florida. He testified at length about his experience, his resume, what he's done in the community. He talked about the limitations on a medical examiner in finding sometimes the cause of death, but especially the manner of death. And he referred to an analogy of finding someone at the bottom of a stairway, which is a very important analogy in a case like this. If we were to come across a woman, let's say a woman with a broken neck at the bottom of a stairway, the first thing that comes to my mind is that she's probably fallen and broken her neck. But if you were later to find out that just before her fall, she had a discussion with an arch enemy that had motive to kill her, suggesting she may have been pushed, changes the entire circumstance. If true, it makes it a homicide and not death by accident. But there's nothing on the body that would change. There's nothing that the medical examiner could say in looking at the body that this is a homicide. With that kind of evidence, I think it's reasonable to expect the manner of death would be undetermined, like we have here. Undetermined because the scientist is limited in what he can do in a case like this and can't say whether it's a homicide or an accident or death by natural circumstances. We know it's not suicide. There's been a stipulation to that fact. But it's undetermined, and it's up to the jury to decide. He talked about how she drowned. There was no evidence of myocarditis. Absolutely no evidence of myocarditis, he testified to when looking at the slides, and we showed those slides to you. Michelle drowned beyond a reasonable degree of medical certainty. So the standard for a scientist is reasonable degree of medical certainty, and you can make a finding, a hard and fast, confident finding. He went beyond that to find that she drowned. He talked about her throwing up water, the number of cups of water, 3 to 4 cups the first time, then 2 to 3 cups, with the latter being pink and frothy, evidence that that water was coming from the lungs. Most significantly, he talked about the dilution of the chemical substances in her blood. It was diluted up to 50%. 20% of that was due to the liquids given to her in the life-saving efforts, but the additional 30% is attributed to drowning. Sodium and calcium weren't diluted, but she received those substances in the life-saving processes, the sodium or the bicarbonate and the calcium. Michelle's heavy lungs, another indicator of drowning, and the fact that hemolysis occurred. It occurred much earlier than would be expected if she had not drowned. We've talked, ladies and gentlemen, about motive a little bit. We haven't talked about circumstantial evidence. Instruction number 19, the latter part has some very significant language. It says, before you can find the defendant guilty of any charge, there must be enough evidence, direct evidence, or circumstantial evidence, or some of both. to convince you of the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It is up to you to decide. There is a mountain of circumstantial evidence here, ladies and gentlemen. And in the latter days of trial, you also heard a bunch of direct evidence. Evidence coming from the defendant's own words that he killed his wife. There is more than enough evidence to convict the defendant here beyond a reasonable doubt. He's guilty of murder and obstruction of justice. You heard from several inmates. You heard from inmate number one. Inmate number one came forward on his own back in May, contacted law enforcement authorities from Louisiana. He testified on the stand that he hadn't had any contact, or he didn't even know the other federal inmates that had testified here. He talked about getting to know the defendant in an A+ computer class. That's a fact that's confirmed in the letters between Gypsy and Martin. He talked about how they became friendly. They used to walk the track together. When rumors surfaced from a Nancy Grace show that the defendant had killed his wife, he asked him. He said, "Hold on, I'll tell you later." And over the course of time, he had conversations with the defendant. The defendant told this inmate that his wife was in the way and wouldn't let go. She was threatening to take the kids and house in a divorce. So he drugged her up with a bunch of oxys. The Percocet is oxycodone. He drugs her up with oxys and sleeping pills, the Ambien, helped her into the tub, held her head under the water, and helped her out. On cross-examination, this inmate was referred to his report, or excuse me, not his report, but his transcript of his interview with Detective Robinson in late May of this year. And in there, he talked about Michelle taking the drugs, not knowing what she was taking. I can't emphasize how significant that statement is, ladies and gentlemen. That's a window into what Martin was telling this individual about the circumstances leading up to Michelle's death. She didn't know what she was taking. Why? Because she had the bandages over her face, over her eyes. How in the world is inmate number one going to know that fact? That in drugging her up, because in his report he talks about drugging her up to get her to die, and on the day she died, drugs her up and puts her in the tub. How's he going to know about the bandages? He told this inmate it'd be hard to prove because they could say she took all those meds because of her surgery, fixed up a tub, fixed up a bath, and just nodded off. It's interesting that he would describe it that way because fixing yourself up a tub and then just nodding off is not consistent with falling into the tub with your head down, but it's more consistent with fixing yourself a normal bath and being in a normal position to take a bath. The defense challenged him about getting something in return for his testimony. There's nothing that state investigators, state prosecutors can give this individual. I think it's clear from the record that was established that he was looking to get something for his testimony. Who wouldn't, quite frankly? He's in Louisiana. He approaches us after he hears from another fellow inmate that was in Texarkana that Martin's been arrested and he's charged with his murder's wife, and he comes forward. He talked about the risks of coming forward, being killed or stabbed, beaten up. One of the other inmates talked about being raped as a consequence of coming forward, being labeled a snitch in the federal system. Not only is he not getting anything for his testimony, ladies and gentlemen, he's suffering a significant detriment. To come forward and tell the truth, to make the right decision. Inmate number one talked about how he's got another couple years on his sentence. He thinks it's part of his rehabilitation. Do the right thing and come forward. Inmate number two talked about his relationship with his girlfriend. He thought it was his wife that he would write back and forth to in prison. He did talk about knowing about the defendant's previous wife, that she had had plastic surgery. He testified that the defendant said the medications were prescribed and nobody can prove it. Undetected, no proof. Why would someone make a statement like that? They can't prove it. They've got nothing on me. Nobody can prove it. Inmate number 3 talked about how he was friends with Doc, with the defendant. They used to lift weights together. They used to run together. They did push-ups, dips, bench, curls. He used to run 4 to 5 miles per day. When asked about the defendant keeping up with him, he said, I couldn't keep up with the defendant. And he testified with respect to Michelle MacNeill's death that the defendant said, nah, I didn't murder her. If I did, they don't have any evidence. Again, just saying they don't have evidence to prove it. Talked about the risk of being killed, stabbed, raped, or even burned in prison for coming forward. He's getting nothing for his testimony. Inmate number 4 talked about how the defendant would do wind sprints. He didn't limp. He didn't have a cane. And he said, with respect to Michelle MacNeill's death, that the defendant said, quote, that bitch drowned. Referred to his wife as a bitch. If she died of an accident, if she died of natural causes, if this was an untimely death, why in the world would you refer to your wife in that fashion? She's done nothing to you. And you refer to her like that? And he describes the defendant saying that she drowned. You heard from Jason Poirier, an inmate at the Utah County Jail. Struck up a quick relationship with the defendant when they were in. Talks about the first conversation. He approaches him about his shoes, saying, where do I get a pair of shoes like that? He talks about how, well, I can get away with a lot of things. I'm getting away with murder. Poirier talks about how at first he didn't believe him. I think this was December 17th. A couple days later, on December 19th, he approaches him and says, I'm sorry about your wife's death. He said, no. The defendant said, no, I'm glad the bitch is dead. Again, referring to his wife in that fashion. This guy's in Utah County. The first inmate's in Louisiana. He was in Texas before that when he got to know the defendant. The other defendants are in Texas. They all talk about the same thing. But they don't really know each other. They haven't certainly had an opportunity to talk about this as far as inmate number 1 and Jason Poirier here in Utah County. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm about to wrap up. I've probably belabored a number of things, but I want to talk just about a few things first. Instruction number 33 is the murder elements instruction. This is important because it's kind of like a checklist for you to look at the elements, what needs to be found with respect to murder. Element 1 is that on or about April 11th, 2007 in the state of Utah. That's undisputed. Number 2, the defendant, Martin MacNeill, is the person who caused the death of Michelle MacNeill and did so under one of the following circumstances. You have to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. You have to be firmly convinced the defendant killed his wife. He either did so intentionally or knowingly, or he intended to cause serious bodily injury to her, committed an act that was clearly dangerous to human life that caused her death, or that the defendant acted under circumstances evidencing a depraved indifference to human life and knowingly engaged in conduct which created a grave risk of death and thereby caused the death of Michelle MacNeill. The following instruction talks about how to find murder, there doesn't have to be unanimity among the 3 alternatives under element 3 to find the defendant committed murder. Make no doubt, we believe he intentionally and knowingly caused the death of his wife. The evidence supports it. The motive is there, it's dripping. The means are there, and the opportunity is there. The obstruction statute, or elements instruction, is instruction number 37. And again, under the 3rd element, you can find A, B, C, or D with respect to finding him guilty of obstruction of justice. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the state, we are so appreciative of your attention that you've given this matter. We've been in trial now for 4 weeks today. You've been very attentive, and you've listened carefully to the evidence. You've asked very intelligent and important questions throughout this process. To the extent, this is a big decision, to the extent that you may be persuaded by mercy or compassion, number one, you're instructed not to make your decision based on emotion. But I would say mercy, ladies and gentlemen, is no substitute for justice withheld. It is time for the truth to have its day. It's been almost 7 years since Michelle's death. It is time for the truth to come out. Do the right thing. Do the right thing and convict Martin MacNeill of murder and obstructing justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grunander. What I'd like to do is take a recess at this time. Please keep in mind my admonition to you. You remain under your duty not to form or express any opinion about the case until it's been finally submitted to you for deliberation. You're not to discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anyone else or any subject of the trial. Avoid any internet media coverage, radio, television, or otherwise. Do no research on your own using computers, iPads, iPhones, smartphones, or something else. When we return, the defense will close. Court's in recess.